He had been probably the only unifying figure in the Weimar Republic, especially towards other countries. And he was also a very lonely man because of that. He had no big party apparatus behind him. He was a foreign minister in a government which was always a coalition between left and center. So what happened after he died? Well, first of all, 3 weeks later, there was no causal relationship, but 3 weeks later, Wall Street crashed. Next year, the Grand Coalition in Germany collapsed. And it was already the beginning of the end of parliamentary democracy in Germany and the beginning of the rule by presidential decree, eventually paving the way for the Nazis to come to power.
Hello, everyone. Today, something quite different, a mid-20th century European history lesson and a very personal family and contemporary story from, of, and with my special guest. History is, after all, the story of people, his story. It's also a story which somehow, by happen chance, connects my guest's family with mine through the village of Thoiry in France and the home of my daughter and her family, which is where I am today. By the way, for those of you with a thorough knowledge of French geography, I'm in Thoiry in the Département l'Ain, if I pronounce that correctly. That's the one of the 3 Thoirys in France, which is immediately adjacent to Geneva. I'm sure some of you listening will know the town and might even be living here yourselves. Mid-20th century Europe was a time dominated by war, tragic, costly, and epoch-defining conflict. And after the end of both World War I and World War II, huge efforts, not only by the great powers of that time, but also by other states which had been drawn into those wars, to find a lasting peace, or at least a modus operandi which would enable a lasting peace and durable peace. Only a few European countries escaped being drawn into those wars, and as you know, Switzerland was one of them. My focus today will be Germany. In fact, Germany and to a lesser extent France, focusing on the period around the time of World War I and the 10 to 15 years following it. And why? Because my guest today is Walter Stresemann, a good friend whose late grandfather and his legacy are what the French call the fil rouge, the red thread that links apparently unconnected places and people together, namely Thoiry, Geneva, Mackay, and Stresemann. Welcome, Walter. Welcome to the Mackay interview, and thanks for making time for me.
Michael, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's good to have you here, and grateful thanks to my daughter who's invited us here to use her very welcoming dining table for our recorded conversation in her home, and whose address carries the name of your grandfather. Walter, my interviews are too short to spend time giving our audience spoiler alerts, so to begin with, please tell me and our listeners who your late grandfather was, what was his name, and apart from being a very important part of your family tree, why is he significant?
Thank you, Michael. My grandfather's name was Gustav Stresemann. He was born in 1878 and is, of course, best known for his efforts to create Europe, a European peace, mainly with France and Aristide Briand, for which both received the Nobel Peace Prize almost exactly 100 years ago. My grandfather came from a relatively simple, modest background. His father was a shopkeeper and a brewer of white beer. However, he escaped, if I may put it this way, this background quickly and became, at the age of 23, after having studied economics, the head of the Industrial Association of Saxony, and at 28 he became member of the German Parliament, the youngest member of Parliament, as a deputy of the National Liberal Party.
Saxony, for those of us whose geography of Germany is not so good, whereabouts is Saxony?
Saxony is southeast of Berlin, south of Berlin, and the main two cities are Dresden, where my father was born, and Leipzig.
Leipzig, okay. Yeah. So tell me a bit more about what was Germany like? I mean, it's such a big question to ask. What was Germany like at that time? It was a big country, a long time ago. But in that period leading up to the outbreak of 1914, the World War I, what was Germany like?
During those days, and contrary to the United Kingdom and France, Germany was a very autocratic society, but had become an industrial powerhouse. The monarchy was extremely autocratic. I often heard from my father that in those years it was described, the German population, as pompous. The attitude was that Germany didn't have its place under the sun. And following the victory of the war, the Prussian War against France in 1870, the entire atmosphere in Germany was that Germany had its own right. Germany was in the center of Europe and earned a lot, deserved a lot more, especially also as regards overseas colonies.
Which is quite an important thing then, given the legacy of Bismarck and the carving up of Africa in 1870.
Correct. And that Congress had taken place in Berlin. Yeah. Correct.
So tell me a bit more about Germany at that time, 1914. The social life, was it centered on the main cities? Berlin was different from Hamburg, different from Frankfurt, different from Munich?
I think of course, there was a concentration of power in Berlin because Berlin was the capital of Prussia. Let's not forget, Germany only existed as a nation since 1870. The interesting part with all this autocratic and pompous regime that ruled Germany was that it was quite advanced as regards social policy. Bismarck had already introduced a certain form of what we could call today modern social security. And my grandfather had a very interesting philosophy, ideology, as member of the National Liberal Party. And as the name of that party indicates, there was the national part, the aggressive part, the idea that unrestrained submarine and maritime expansion was almost a divine right for Germany. And on the other hand, in terms of social policy, Gustav Stresemann was more on the left spectrum because he firmly believed that without a certain docility of the working class, social unrest was not good for productivity. And most importantly, Gustav Stresemann, as an economist, appreciated the fact that the working class also deserved a certain purchasing power, which was good for the economy as a whole.
So your grandfather, Gustav, then was in business, in industry, but was representing industrialists, or he had his own business?
He did not have his own business. Today you would say he was a lobbyist. He was also, which today might be unthinkable as a politician, he was on the board of several companies, especially in the chocolate industry. Now, when you talk chocolate industry and colonization, obviously there's an interest. And before the war, one of the interesting aspects of his reflections were that perhaps there was a possibility to have a kind of alliance with the United Kingdom to develop together overseas colonies. Of course, that never happened because the United Kingdom, France, and Russia then created the Trilateral Alliance that in effect did not lead to World War I, but there was a fait accompli, as we would say in French, and Germany therefore then rearmed even more.
So I'm thinking of Switzerland played an important part in post-World War I international relations and political history. And I'm thinking particularly of the League of Nations, especially established by the Paris Peace Conference in 1920, though actually based here in Geneva, and the Locarno treaties. Locarno, for those who don't know, being a lovely town on the shores of Lake Maggiore in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. Walter, please explain what part Gustav played in that immediate post-war period from 1918.
Well, he was first and foremost shocked and dismayed by Germany's loss in World War I. However, he quickly realized that there was no alternative anymore to some kind of understanding and cooperation between European nations. Of course, the Versailles Treaty was an immense burden for Germany. When Germany couldn't pay reparations, the French and Belgians occupied the Ruhr. That led to printing of money because Germany continued to pay all the workers. Let's not forget the Ruhr is an industrial powerhouse.
It's huge.
It's huge. And this printing of money led to hyperinflation and the 1923 monetary reform in Germany. But already the role of the United States was becoming more and more active, at least from an economic and financial perspective. And the Dawes Plan then meant that the French left the Ruhr, and Germany was able to reschedule the reparations payment.
Just tell me a little bit more about who was Dawes and what was this Dawes Plan?
The Dawes Plan was basically, Dawes was a U.S. finance secretary, and the Dawes Plan really was a typical, like you see it today, like the IMF and the World Bank, rescheduling debt payments to ease, because the German debt was, reparations payment were almost 13% of German GDP at the time. Now, to get back to Locarno, we must understand that the situation was less tense, and all the powers, the main powers, arrived in Locarno. Beautiful sunny October days in 1925. Imagine, my grandfather, being the foreign minister, was there with the Chancellor. The Germans were there also with Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, as were the Brits and everybody else. And they were there for 4 or 5 days. I mean, today a summit is 2 days. Now, my grandfather...
It took a long time to get there in those days.
It took a long time to get there as well, yes. Now, there's a little anecdote which I think illustrates quite well the talent, the diplomatic talent of my grandfather, which he already had to employ for the currency reforms in 23, because a lot depended on American money already. So my grandfather decided to take everybody out on a boat ride on Lago Maggiore. And he instructed the captain to stay on water until my grandfather would say, "Go back." And they were all in this cabin on the boat, and it was extremely warm. And Gustav Stresemann rattled off all of Germany's demands. Not that those would be satisfied, but that they would at least be discussed. Everybody said, "Look, yes, we'll talk about it, just get us back. Just get us back to shore." And Aristide Briand said, "If we would have stayed 5 more minutes on the water, I don't know what I would have conceded to Germany."
Really? Because it was so pleasant, or
it was so hot in the cabin?
It's so hot
yes.
in the cabin. Okay.
But what was really born was the spirit, what was known later as the spirit of Locarno, meaning that people got together not to throw invectives at each other, but the spirit of Locarno was that 7 years after the end of World War I, people politicians were talking to each other again in a civilized manner, and certainly in a way to project peace and prosperity in Europe. And that was the Locarno spirit.
It's good. I wish we had more of that today. Yeah.
Yes, but it didn't last long either.
No, that's true. But at least the attempt was made, and I think that's the important thing. Walter, my knowledge of history of that period is patchy, to say the least. I've read that 1923 is referred to as the year of crises. Why is it called that?
Well, there were several crises in Germany. We already spoke about the hyperinflation. The hyperinflation, the cause was the occupation of the Ruhr. There was also the Munich famous beer hall putsch by Hitler, who was then arrested, and ironically, because of his arrest, he became more popular. And let's not forget, in the same year, we also had a communist beginning of a rebellion in Saxony and Thuringia. So all these domestic political crises, because the Weimar Republic was a kind of an artificial construct after the monarchy, and it was the unloved republic, and Gustav Stresemann was basically what he himself called, well, a realist in an unloved republic.
So he was the Chancellor in 23?
He was the Chancellor for precisely 100 days.
I see. Okay.
And saw through, together with others, the currency reform. Let's not forget, a newspaper in those days cost 1.5 billion Reichsmark.
And there was paper money that was produced for that?
There was paper money that was produced, and when I talk about a billion, I mean a European billion, so that's billion.
Million.
Yes. Yeah. So 12 zeros for a newspaper.
For a newspaper.
Correct.
Oh my God. Yeah. My guest today is Walter Stresemann, a good friend from Geneva, the founder and managing director of Magnolia Family Office, and the grandson of Gustav Stresemann, a politician and statesman who was for a time the Chancellor of Germany's Weimar Republic. And we're in Thoiry, just across the border with Switzerland, and why we are here will very soon become apparent. Walter, the famous 1926 Thoiry meeting with Aristide Briand took place no more than a couple of hundred meters from where we are seated now. You should tell me, Walter, before I continue, what was it then and what is it now? And then I'll come back to the rest of my question. What was it then, this place?
Thoiry was an isolated little village here in the northern Jura mountains. And it basically was a place that had been chosen for Gustav Stresemann and Aristide Briand to meet privately.
Okay, we're going to come to that. So tell me now, Walter, why the meeting? Why with Aristide Briand? Who was he? And why here in Thoiry? I mean, what were the expectations of that meeting? And what was the result? Which I guess is the most important thing.
Well, you see, in Locarno, the biggest success of Gustav Stresemann until then had been that Germany had been readmitted to the League of Nations in Geneva. And in September, both Briand and Stresemann gave extremely passionate speeches before the League of Nations. A little anecdote. Why Gustav Stresemann and Aristide Briand? Well, back in Locarno, the then Chancellor of Germany, Hans Luther, gave a very dry, programmatic speech about politics in general, the future of Europe. And at one point, Aristide Briand, who had a fantastic sense of humor, said, "Dear Chancellor, if you continue like this, we are all going to cry." And to Aristide Briand's great surprise, the person who laughed out loudest and most was my grandfather. So the two gentlemen got along extremely well from the very beginning. And it's interesting, Briand himself came from quite modest upbringings. His father had a cafe in Nantes. They were from Saint-Nazaire originally.
Yeah.
Aristide Briand was a socialist. Mm-hmm. My grandfather was a national liberal, but as mentioned before, on social politics, relatively to the left. Now, it was the two of them wanted to promote the agenda of European cooperation and peace. My grandfather once exclaimed, where is the European currency? Where is the European stamp?
Even in those times, he said
Even in those times. He once said, you can only be a realist if you're also a utopian. So let's get to Thoiry and the arrangement of this meeting, and I would love to quote Time magazine and their edition of the 27th of September 1926. I quote, Foreign Minister Stresemann of Germany slipped away from Geneva by motor one afternoon last week. Wily Foreign Minister Briand of France went for a boat ride, was met some miles from Geneva by Dr. Stresemann's motor. Chuckling at the success of their ruse to deceive news-gatherers, they were driven swiftly across the Swiss border to the tiny French mountain village of Thoiry. There they sought a snug inn famed for its cuisine. Time magazine says for no reason whatsoever the Chalet Russe, but it is of course the Hotel Léger, which existed until 1957 and is now a bakery here in central Thoiry.
That's correct, yeah.
So this was a very secretive meeting, which was only attended by the French Secretary of State. His name was Hénard. He was bilingual, and he did much of the translation, even though my grandfather did speak some French and certainly understood French quite well. Both Briand and Stresemann really, I think, had a very good time here in Thoiry. Excuse me for putting it that way. Apart from very programmatic issues that needed to be discussed in terms of bilateral French-German relations, they got carried away a bit. They had ideas of European cooperation, of greater integration, that remind me a bit of what Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan discussed back in 1986 close to Geneva.
In Geneva,
yes. Where the question was, let's get rid of all atomic weapons, and once they were back home, people told them, look, it's not going to be that simple. And Briand and Stresemann, in their respective countries, had a lot of pushback by especially the right-wing political forces.
Yeah, so it sounds like the expectations really sort of grew and grew as their relationship improved over a glass of wine, a bottle of wine, maybe even 2 bottles of wine.
I believe there was a young student in Germany for a couple of years ago did a study on this meeting, and I met him several times, and he maintained that on the bill there were 5 bottles of wine.
5 bottles.
3 people.
3 people. Enough said. So what was the result of the meeting, apart from finishing off the bottles?
Well, the result was that very quickly there was disillusionment. And there was also criticism by Chamberlain in London, who feared that Germany and France were going ahead of things, and that the UK might find itself in front of a signed deal that they would just need to ratify. In the end, nothing much happened because the best of intentions, did not last. On the other hand, we need to say that the entire economic picture was much better everywhere, in Germany especially. Gustav Stresemann wanted to use the weakness of the French franc as a bargaining chip for extra credits, because Germany had a lot of access, especially to American money, American loans. But for some reason, the French franc restabilized by itself, and therefore maybe financial circles in London had something to do with that. But he lost that leverage in negotiating various political issues with France. In the end, you could not say there were tangible results. But the fact that these two men projected themselves and projected ideas into something that one day would become Europe. They were precursors of what Adenauer and de Gaulle did after World War II. They were precursors, and this is why it was really the Thoiry meeting that convinced the Nobel Committee to give them the Nobel Peace Prize.
That was what I was going to ask you.
December.
They won the Nobel Peace Prize in the same year. Was that a surprise? Did the records show, or the newspaper reports, or did parties feel that was a just reward for the efforts that they'd made? Well,
back in those days, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize was very Euro or let's say Western-centric. Yeah. But I think there was a large consensus that indeed, not even 10 years after the end of World War I, there was great hope, there were great expectations that Europe would perhaps finally get its act together. We still talk about that today, fortunately, in a peaceful Europe.
Yeah. Walter, the history books record the sudden death of your grandfather in October of 29. Now, that was obviously a family tragedy. He was only 51 years old. But what was the impact of this on the political scene in Germany and on Germany's neighbours, especially France?
Indeed. It was a sudden death. I would say sudden because he died of, even in those days, 51 was young age.
Yeah.
But my grandfather's health had always been very weak. And the hatred that he confronted on the right wing of his own party, and then there were other parties much further to the right, the DNVP, Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei, and of course the Nazis. This entire illusion that Germany had actually lost the war because moderates like Stresemann had stabbed a dagger in the back of the German military was most unfortunate, and he suffered from his health increasingly. In 1928, he famously said, "The right-wing parties in Germany, the right wing, they have all gone mad. I can now only govern with the left." And his health deteriorated more and more. His doctor needed to be with him on every trip. There was a famous conference in The Hague where his doctor had to basically interrupt the meetings regularly to take care of Gustav Stresemann. Nevertheless, when he actually died on October 3rd, 1929, it was a huge shock. And the famous newspaper back in Berlin, back in those days, the Vossische Zeitung said, "This is more than the loss, this is a misfortune, this is a disaster." Now, he had been probably the only unifying figure in the Weimar Republic, especially towards other countries, and he was also a very lonely man because of that. He had no big party apparatus behind him. He was a foreign minister in a government which was always a coalition between left and center. So what happened after he died? Well, first of all, 3 weeks later, there was no causal relationship, But 3 weeks later, Wall Street crashed.
Yeah, of course, 1929 is a very conspicuous year.
Next year, the Grand Coalition in Germany collapsed. And it was already the beginning of the end of parliamentary democracy in Germany and the beginning of the rule by presidential decree, eventually paving the way for the Nazis to come to power.
So that's what I was going to ask you, how his legacy was regarded by by Hitler's Third Reich. What was their view of him?
Well, their view can be summed up like this. He was a traitor, and he had married a Jewish woman. It was probably the worst type of person for the Nazis, a person who had sold out German interests, the German Heimat, to foreign interests and the international Jewry. But let's look over the border. How did France deal with Gustav Stresemann's death? Well, Aristide Briand came to the cemetery in 1930. He kneeled down on my grandfather's grave and said, "You can now order another coffin." And in fact, he died a year later.
So, really? Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's tragic. Yeah.
But before Aristide Briand died, and understandably so, France expedited the construction of the Maginot Line, the famous Maginot Line that Hitler's troops then went around
yes.
going through Belgium. So the economic relations, of course, became worse, simply also through the Wall Street crash. And France became extremely suspicious of German intentions going forward, because there was no longer this statesman, famous historian Jonathan Wright, an English historian, called my grandfather the greatest statesman of the Weimar Republic. And indeed he was a statesman, because he really looked beyond pure German interests. Of course he was German and pro-German interests, but he had this knack of being able to transpose himself and understand where the other party was coming from. And he always wanted to bridge different sides, because he was a politician of compromise.
And let's just take a little glimpse ahead to Germany after the war in relation to your late grandfather. When Germany turned the page in 1949 and embraced democracy from the time of Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of West Germany. And by the way, I read a contemporary of your grandfather, born almost within 1 or 2 years of each other. How was he seen by that period of time? Those people, the Adenauers, the Willy Brandts, the Erfurts, those sorts of people.
Well, that's a very good question. You see, after his demise and before Hitler came to power, I believe in 1932, a very important monument was put up in Mainz, in Germany, to honor the work of my grandfather. When the Nazis came to power, they tore it down right away. By the late 50s, this monument and this memorial had been reconstructed. So, and it's interesting because Adenauer and Gustav Stresemann knew each other quite well, and they didn't like each other. For Gustav Stresemann, Adenauer, who was mayor of Cologne, was Catholic. Gustav Stresemann was Protestant from the East. And there was a certain ambiguity, because Gustav Stresemann thought, well, Adenauer, he's so close to the Rhine. Is he doing deals with the French himself?
Yes, yes.
Another little story: the organ of the cathedral in Cologne.
It's a fabulous cathedral. Yeah.
There was a lot of work of renovation in there. Millions of Reichsmark, new Reichsmark at the time, and Gustav Stresemann once said, "I don't know what Adenauer is doing, but how can I convince France and other countries that German reparations are too high when he's spending millions on his cathedral?"
Oh dear, oh dear. Yeah.
My father, who knew Willy Brandt quite well, Willy Brandt, after all, was also a mayor of Berlin in the late 50s, early 60s, for instance, when Kennedy came. And later on, Willy Brandt, of course, became famous and got a Nobel Peace Prize as well for his Ostpolitik, his politics of détente towards Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And I remember quite well my father writing and explaining this to me, to Willy Brandt, saying, "You remind me of my father."
It's a great compliment.
I think he took it as such.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Walter, we must dovetail, because we're moving towards the end of our conversation now. We must dovetail your personal story into the narrative of your politically significant grandfather and the rest of your immediate ancestors. Where were you born? And what were your parents doing wherever you were born at the time? And where did you actually grow up? Because, you know, when I met you the first time a few years ago, I thought you were an American. You sound like an American. So tell me your story. Some people say, I sound like an Englishman, which is true, and I look like a Jamaican. But tell me your, tell me your story. Yeah?
Well, as mentioned, my grandmother was of Jewish origin. She had to escape Germany in the late 30s, a very adventurous escape by marrying a Norwegian diplomat, getting a diplomatic pass, and together with my uncle, they emigrated to the United States. My father followed in 1939, about several weeks just before the outbreak of the Second World War. He came through Geneva and then took a boat from Genoa to New York. He became American during the war, I believe in 1942, because otherwise he would have not been able to become conductor of the Toledo Symphony Orchestra, because you needed to be part of the Union, and in order to be part of the Union, you needed to be a U.S. citizen. Well, 1942, we're talking about Stalingrad. I think my father didn't necessarily expect ever to return back to Germany. However, in Toledo, Ohio, he met my mother, who was born and raised American, from Detroit. And believe it or not, I was born in Detroit.
You were born in Detroit?
Because her father was a pediatrician.
I see. And your father was a professional musician?
Yes, he conductor at the time, and then later the head general manager of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra.
Oh, yeah.
So I was born in Detroit. My father was already on his way back to Berlin, and my mother and I then followed 6 months later, and I grew up in Berlin, or what we then called West Berlin.
Yeah, speaking Berliner English.
Exactly. Well, I grew up
with
with
a very special accent.
2 languages, American from my mom's side and Deutsch von meiner Vaterseite.
It must have been a fascinating city at that time.
It was absolutely fascinating. I remember I was 6 years old when the wall went up, but my greatest memory as a kid was, of course, John F. Kennedy's famous speech. I was in that crowd.
Really?
I was in that crowd with my mom.
Donut.
Ich bin ein Berliner, ein Donut.
A donut, yeah.
Yeah, and then to make a long story short, I studied in the United States, in Germany, in France, and When I did my master's at Columbia in New York, they had an exchange program with the Graduate Institute of International Studies here in Geneva.
I see. That's how you ended up coming around here.
I came around here in 1981 and have been here ever since.
Okay. And your professional life, you're in the finance business?
Yes, I'm in the finance and business. I've been in the trust business, and I've acted as a trustee for the last 40 years.
Oh, a long time. So you developed
quite a long time.
Professional life to it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. If it's an intrusive question, tell me, and we'll just move on to something else. But how would you describe your links to Germany? Would the German word Heimat be appropriate? And perhaps, Walter, you'd better define Heimat, as it has a particular meaning in German, which from when I learned to speak some basic German, it was always a difficult word to translate into English. It's not quite the same thing meaning in English.
You're absolutely correct, Michael. Heimat, like many German words, Schadenfreude, are very difficult to translate into the more precise English or French. The word Heimat has something romantic about it. I think if you would read Goethe, Heimat was certainly a very romantic type of and maybe nostalgic term. However, it was then used by the Nazis as, let's say, an expression of, Heimat became really what German National Socialists wanted it to be, i.e., a very dogmatic, a very ideological term, and
exclusive. Just
very exclusive, and if you were thinking any way differently, you were an enemy of the Heimat, and it's a term that I have more difficulties with because I've always found it in a way a bit even repugnant, and La Patrie is something very different than Heimat, and as I told you, Michael, I'm probably a bit more Anglo-Saxon than German. But again, Heimat, for me, it's not my Heimat. Although I love Berlin, I grew up there, but Germany, I cannot say is my Heimat. And like many people in Geneva, we don't really have one.
we sort of ended up in this interesting city and feel that we belong here, even if we've come from somewhere else, or especially if we've come from somewhere else. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Last question. It's not really a question, Walter, but it won't surprise you that it's coming at the end of our fascinating conversation. What are your observations of today's Germany that you would highlight as worthy of note, given its very difficult 20th century history? And if you had words of praise and a word or two of caution about Germany, please share them with us all.
Of course, today's Germany, and despite the rise of the AfD, the right-wing, extreme right-wing party, is of course a very different Germany. It has found its place in the center of Europe. It was a huge mistake. The Versailles Treaty was a huge mistake. You remember at the end of World War II, there was an American politician by the name of Morgenthau who wanted to turn Germany into a pure agricultural country.
Yes.
Well, Germany has always been an industrial country. It sits in the middle of Europe and it needs to deal with its neighbors, East and West. And I think despite all the complaints, it does just that today. And of course, the situation with Russia and Ukraine is a special one. But the fact is, today Germany is firmly integrated in Europe. But what it needs to do, it needs to show more leadership. And because of its history, Germany showing leadership, of course, creates jitters everywhere else. But in terms of realpolitik today, it's an absolute necessity because it is by far the largest economy in Europe and it needs to show the way. And I think it can. You see, maybe I could quote my grandfather because it is a problem today of Germany because Germans are... Germans think that problems can easily go away if one just ignores them. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a German trait. And my grandfather back in his day said, most Germans have only one prayer: Lord, give us our daily illusion today.
He said that, did he?
He said that. But what I think if you may, I could quote him one last time.
Please, please.
And I think it's a quote that people should bear in mind. And it shows how until the end of his life, his only one urgency was to obtain more concessions from France, from the West, because reparations were still a problem, and he could feel the rise of nationalism from the right stronger and stronger. And this he said to the British diplomat Sir Albert Bruce Lockhart in 1928. If the Allies had obliged me just one single time, I would have brought the German people behind me. Yes, even today I could still get them to support me. However, they gave me nothing, and the minor concessions they made always came too late. Thus, nothing else remains for us but brutal force. The future lies in the hands of the new generation. Moreover, they, the German youth, who we could have won for peace and reconstruction, we have lost. Herein lies my tragedy, and there the Allies' crime.
There's a strong sense of frustration in those words.
Yes, and a sense of frustration that his life was ending and they would never be able to achieve and conclude what he wanted to. And that was to avoid the extreme right coming to power. He is said to have expressed the following at the end of his life: if the Nazis ever come to power, the red flag will end up on the Brandenburg Gate. And that's precisely what happened.
Yes, exactly. Walter, many thanks for answering my questions so fully and so thoughtfully, and in a way opening up some of your private thoughts to a much wider audience. It's been absolutely fascinating. My guest today has been Walter Stresemann, the Geneva-based grandson of Gustav Stresemann, Chancellor of the Weimar Republic in Germany in 1923 and Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1923 to 1929. Walter, thank you so much.
Michael, thank you. It's been a privilege and really a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the McKay Interview podcast. You can find my show on most of the leading podcast platforms, plus the complete playlist dating back to 2012 can be found by writing The McKay Interview into your browser. Thanks again for listening.